All right, here goes nothing.
Yes. You can wait until after I go over this? Okay, thanks. Okay, so on your quiz, you are going to need to know the range of apertures. I would say, instead of memorizing this entire list of numbers, I would find just the two most important ones, like f2.8. That one is going to be only in the list of correct apertures, and this will be multiple choice. So I won't make you remember all of these. They will be in a multiple choice question. Also, one to look for is f22. So on the incorrect list of apertures, it might end with like f26 or f100 or something like that. But f22 is the number that will be in the correct answer. Yes.
So you said it'll be like different.
The
like
distractor
like,
ones will be made up numbers.
Yeah. Okay.
Yeah. Or it will be like 2, 4, 6, 8, 10, 12, you know, something that's not this list of numbers. So look for f22. So instead of memorizing all of them, just remember that one. You know, that would be my recommendation. I think that's easiest. Okay, the camera parts right here. Again, you'll want to memorize all of them, but not all of them will be on the quiz. I think there'll be like 7 to 10 different answers instead of like 19 or whatever are on here. So the viewfinder, you'll want to know that. That's super important. The LCD screen, that's where your picture displays. If you press this playback button, your picture will be on the back of the camera there. The live view mode button, that's important. So that's if you wanted to have your viewfinder fill the screen. The cross keys, you can move up and down or left and right. And this is also how you change things like the ISO and use the set button to make selections. The menu button, that's obvious. It says menu on it, so that shouldn't be too hard. And then down here, make sure you know where the lens autofocus is. We've been using that a little bit whenever we use telephoto lenses, and sometimes you have to put it in manual focus. It's right there on the top of the lens. The hot shoe flash, that is where you put a bounce flash. And then this is the flash button that pops up this ugly, awful pop-up flash. You don't want to use that if at all possible. It just makes your pictures look really flat. So bounce flashes are always best. I have one you can borrow. On-off switch, the mode dial, and the shutter release button. Okay, any questions about the camera parts? Those are the important ones that will probably be on the test. Okay. Whoops, I went too far back. So now this next one is like a slideshow. And let's see if I can get it to do closed captioning. That would be exciting. Okay. All right, so before taking your picture, okay, it doesn't work perfect. It says October taking your picture. You're going to want to think about these different settings. So the shutter speed, aperture, ISO, and focus all work together to make a great photo. But in our AV mode, which is the current mode that we are taking a quiz over tomorrow, all you have to worry about is the aperture. So the photographer chooses the aperture, the camera does everything else. Okay, so we'll learn about ISO and shutter speed in our next unit. But for this unit, all you're worried about is the aperture. And again, exposure is balanced, which is the exposure is how light or dark your picture is. It's a balance of those three settings. But you don't need to know all these definitions. Just know that the aperture is the size of that opening within your lens. Okay, so the aperture controls two things in your picture. So first, it controls the amount of light that's entering your camera. So if you were taking pictures at night when it's really dark out, then you might want to use a wider aperture to be able to let in the maximum amount of light possible. Versus if you're taking a picture at high noon, you may want to use the smallest aperture possible, like f22 or f32, whatever's on our cameras, in order to limit how much light is coming into your camera. So that's one thing that the aperture controls. What's the other thing that the aperture controls?
Depth of field. Depth
of field, very good. So we could have depth of field like this image here. What do we call this depth of field? Great. So which aperture might have been used to take a picture that looks like this, where everything's in focus, in the foreground, in the middle ground, in the background? Which aperture? Which aperture number? f16, very good. Now, if you have a picture like this on the quiz, and it asks you, what aperture was used, most likely used, to take this picture, and I gave you the choice between f16 and f2.8, would you be able to figure that out?
Yes,
Yeah.
that's 16.
Yes, f16. Now, I will not give you f11 or f16. Why would I not do that?
Because they're very similar.
Those seen.
They're too similar. You can't really tell the difference between those two. We can tell the difference between these two, so I will never give you like two f-stops that are right next to each other. Unless I might say, okay, which is it? f16, f2.8, or f4? Then I've had people say, hey, you said you weren't going to put those side by side. If they're side by side, it's probably because they're on the wrong end of the spectrum. So you're just going to have one over here on the right side. Does that make sense?
Yeah.
So the distractors, yeah, those could be similar, but I'll never give you like two answers where one is right and the other one right next to it is wrong. Okay, so if you look at the way that these openings are related to one another, these are related in terms of halving and doubling. What I mean by that is f4 lets in twice as much light as f5.6, which lets in twice as much light as f8. So each time we're going down in our sequence, we're cutting the amount of light that's hitting our film in half. Similarly, if we move this direction, each time we open up our aperture, we're letting in twice as much light. So f5.6, if you move to f4, it's letting in twice as much light. If you move to f2.8, it's twice as much light. So there might be a question that asks, you know, you have f5.6 and f8, how are they related? Well, f8 is letting in half as much light as f5.6. Yes?
Are you writing on the quiz?
There will be one question on the back, where you have to write.
How many questions is that?
Like 20?
Okay.
Yeah.
What
But
kind of writing?
the front ones, I assume, are multiple choice. then.
Oh, and the matching
Matching.
is like at the back. So you'll do the multiple choice first, and then the camera parts will be on the back.
And then the extra written problem.
On the before the camera parts.
What's it about?
What's it about? I can't tell you that. It's about this concept. I am telling you that. All that I've gone over. Okay, so being able to recognize depth of field, that this is shallow because something in the background is blurry, just one thing is in focus. That's a good indicator that this is a shallow depth of field. And just being able to match that with the right F number. So like F2.8 would result, and I try and remember that like, okay, 2.8 inches is in focus. It's a really, really narrow range of focus, versus this is like 22 feet and beyond is in focus. So that's just how I remember with the F numbers, the range of focus that you have. Also, this F, does anyone know what the F stands for in f-stop? Because stop refers to stopping down our light, letting less and less in.
Focus.
Film is a great guess. Focus is another great guess.
Form.
Figure is another great guess.
Form.
Form, no. I'll give you a hint. It's on the board somewhere.
Oh,
It's written.
feel.
Focal.
Focal, very good.
I
So
tried.
focal length. So f-stop stands for focal length. And what does the focal length refer to?
How
The
far the
camera.
thingy is. From
The thingy, yes, the
camera
thingy,
lens.
aka
I'm
the
trying
lens.
here, guys. Okay, no one else is
Appreciate
saying
it.
anything. I'm trying.
I appreciate it. Okay, so our normal lens is what's usually on the camera, right? When did we use those telephoto lenses?
When we're doing depth. Yeah.
Yes, when we were taking pictures with the aluminum foil in the background. Why do we use telephoto?
Get more detail. Not detail, but more. Less
Yes, less detail in the background. So the telephoto will give you a much softer focus in the background than a normal lens. It'll be more
My
gradient.
mom's like, oh, we can use my camera. I'm like, no, we have to have a different lens for this. And I was like, no, we don't. I'm like, yes, we do.
Sometimes you can make it good enough. It doesn't have to be perfect.
You know, that's why I got like 100 in class because I did that. I want to be.
Okay, so another thing that you'll want to know is that depth of field is controlled by more than just the aperture. So the aperture is probably the biggest determiner of depth of field. So whether you have a really wide aperture or really narrow aperture, that matters. But also the focal length of the lens. We used these telephoto lenses on our aluminum foil experiments because it's going to create the most blurry background for you. And then the third thing is your distance from subject. So again, this will be a multiple choice where you'll have to pick these three out of a range of other answers. So just make sure you can, the aperture definitely has to be one of them. Focal length, look for that F word, it has to be the, length of the lens. And then the other one is just the distance from the subject. For example, if we were trying to blur these in the background is pretty easy because we're so close up, but when we're this far away from the scene, if we try and blur the tower in the background, or no wait, we want that in focus and blur the building behind it, we're not going to be able to do that because it's too far away. We can only have great depth of field at that distance. Okay, any questions so far? Okay, when shooting in aperture priority mode or AV mode, what do you have control over? The aperture, very good. And let's see, being able to recognize, so what aperture might have shot the toy cars?
This one.
This one, very good. F2.8, F4, one of those on this side of the spectrum. Okay, pretty good. I don't know if we have anything else. Oh, which of these opens the widest?
Oh.
The 1.7.
What if you had to choose between F4, F8, and F11?
F4.
F4, very good. Which one opens the narrowest? What do I mean by narrowest?
Like, does it open the most?
The smallest, yeah, between 11, 5.6, and 2.8. 11, very good.
I know.
What about the narrowest between 22,